Okay, thank you again for the organizers for this symposium, and Masa, my friend, for the introduction. I want to do something that's a little bit risky today, which is to give you, in a sense, 3 lectures combined into one. I'm hoping that you will make the connections between the 3. I'll try to help you with that. And the first part is going to be really about what worries me. It's going to be, I'm going to be talking about the state of global food security today, and particularly looking forward to 2050, to mid-century. So it's all about what worries me. The second part is going to be about an initiative that Masa and others mentioned, the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, what we're trying to do in Africa. And for the third part, I want to take you on a very long trip with me close to the North Pole to show you a little bit about what we've done with the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I'll just jump right in. The preponderance of evidence indicates that we are simply it indicates that we need an adjustment on the microphone. The preponderance of evidence shows that we are simply going to fall short of meeting food security needs in 2050. We are not going to meet the Sustainable Development Goal of ensuring that no one goes hungry in the world by 2030. In fact, if current trends go forward, we are going to fall farther short of that in 2050 than we'll be in 2030. The current situation is that some 750, 800 million people are food insecure today. 300 million really don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And 3 billion people on Earth simply can't afford a safe, nutritious diet. In fact, for the low-income people on Earth, they would have to spend twice as much as they currently spend on food to have a nutritious diet. And they're already spending more than 50%, so it's not possible. 58%, in other words, more than half of the people in Africa last year suffered from moderate to severe food insecurity, more than half of the entire continent. And Africa, of course, is going to be the largest continent in terms of population by the end of this century. But the thing that's most heartbreaking, I think, is that 60 million children around the world, children below 5 years of age, are physically and mentally stunted because of poor nutrition. They have mental deficiencies, cognitive deficiencies, and physical stunting, which will last the rest of their lives. 60 million children. Very high percentage rates in Central America and Africa, and even in some Asian countries. So I invite you to imagine what it would be like in Japan if you had a third of your children, or even close to half of your children, physically and mentally stunted. It would be a national catastrophe. It would be a national emergency. You would wonder how Japan is going to develop economically in the future in a peaceful way. But this is the fact of life for many countries in Africa. In other words, the current situation is not a great starting point for achieving food security. If you look forward to 2050, to mid-century, depending on what year you start in, we need to be producing 50 to 70% more food by 2050 just to meet rising food demand. And I'll just mention that food demand is not quite the same as food need. Food demand is when people want something to eat, they want food, and they have the money to go into the marketplace and buy it. That creates demand in the marketplace. But we already have 700 million people or more who don't express demand for food. They don't have the money for food in an economic sense. So we need to be producing 50 to 70% more food to meet demand. And I think that means even more food than that to meet needs. If we can't use projections of food demand to tell us how much more food we need to produce to meet food need, then perhaps we can get some idea of how much we can expect to produce in the future, how much food we can expect to produce. I'll show you a graph here that I admit is a little complicated. I'll try to explain it to you. This is a histogram covering several hundred studies of the effect of climate change on food production. And on the far left, what you'll see is studies that had to do with the food production between 2010 and 2029. And you'll see the bars in blue represent studies that said, well, there could be some positive effect for one or more crops in one or more places. The yellow and orange lines are the studies that show there would be negative effects for some crops in some places. But as you see, as you go forward out into the future, what you'll see is the studies showing positive effects get to be fewer and fewer, and the studies showing negative effects, and in fact, really negative effects with the dark orange, get to be more and more of those. These studies, by the way, go back to 1984. So you can imagine in 1984, you might have had quite a few studies that would have predicted some positive effects, more than you would be getting today. Now, I'm not going to argue that all of the negative things are going to happen. I think that it's okay for us to discuss the details and debate the projections and the data and such. But I think that you can see from this that unless something changes, we are in trouble. Because I would argue that you shouldn't ignore the negative studies. We have to take those into consideration. One of the things that these climate studies don't show you very much of would be other effects. The climate models that I'm familiar with basically show you what is the effect of global warming on a particular crop and crop yield. There are a few other factors involved in agricultural production other than the temperature. So let me show you, I want to talk about actually 6 other, what I would call headwinds, constraints, challenges to food production in the future that typically are not included in these types of studies. Here is, let me think, I think I've gone, oh. Yeah, I want to start with this one. 6 headwinds. Aside from just the effect of warming on crop yields, climate change is going to have a few other effects as well. August was the 547th consecutive month in which the global average temperature exceeded the 20th century average. 547 consecutive months of, quote, above average temperatures. That's quite a trend. We know that higher average temperatures, higher extremes, longer periods of time with extreme weather are all going to have a negative impact on crop yields. What we sometimes don't realize are 2 other effects. One is there's going to be a great deal of fluctuation in temperatures and in the environment. This is a very difficult thing for crops to contend with, and a very difficult thing for crop breeders to breed for. And the second thing is that we're going to throw together unique combinations of species. Global warming is causing the migration of pests and diseases all over the world. So what we are engaged in with climate change is the biggest agricultural experiment in history. It's an agricultural experiment in which we put together a lot of unique combinations of species and see how well they live together. I think we're going to see some surprises. I don't think they're going to be particularly positive ones. And here is a histogram that I think will demonstrate this. On the left is South Africa, on the right is Peru. And I'll just draw your attention for the moment to the blue bars on the left. These are the historical distribution of temperatures, growing season temperatures in those countries going back basically about 100 years. And what you'll see is that at the zero line, the largest numbers, the greatest number of summers were average. That's the mean. And some summers were a little bit cooler and some were a little bit warmer. That's what you would expect. But take a look at the red. And this is the projection for the rest of the century. That's the distribution we expect to see in the rest of the century. And here's the point. You'll notice that they don't overlap very much. And what that tells you is that in the future, you look at the red for a moment, and you go to the very left part of those red bars. Those will be the coolest and best growing seasons of the future. Simply note that they will be hotter and more difficult than the worst of the past. That's an important message to sink in, that for many areas, the best growing seasons of the future will be worse than the worst of the past. So we are exiting climatically congenial times, and we're entering into a period that we have not seen in the last 12,000 years. There are a few other headwinds I'll talk to you about, some other challenges. The first has to do with soil. The African Union estimates that by mid-century, by 2050, half of its cropland will be unusable. That's their word for it, unusable. This is a serious problem for food production in Africa. Ratan Lal, who was a previous food prize laureate, has said that we've lost 25 to 75% of the carbon in our soils, and he speaks of peak soil and extinct soil. He was, by the way, the winner of the 2019 Japan Prize. If you look at one of the basic elements in agriculture, phosphorus, there's also estimates that we will achieve peak phosphorus production by 2050. In other words, we just won't be in a position to produce more phosphorus after that. That'll be the top level. Water. Agriculture already takes most of the world's water, fresh water. But currently, 21 of the world's 37 major aquifers are in a state of depletion. They're being depleted. We're drawing the water out faster than the water is coming in. There was an article in Nature Sustainability in April of this year looking at 900 different scenarios for 235 different water basins around the world. And it found that on average, the extraction would be peaking in 2050. So we need to be producing much more food by 2050, but the soil is getting worse, and the maximum water that we're going to be able to use will peak about that time. And about that time, half of the world's population is going to be living in areas with serious water constraints, and that includes China and Egypt and Ethiopia, India, Iran, Jordan, Pakistan. The, fourth headwind that I've put up on the board, on the screen here is conflict. That's a difficult one because food security creates conflict and conflict creates food security. If we want food security in the world, we have to break that connection between conflict and food security, food insecurity. Historically, we've had a high correlation between periods of food insecurity and periods of war and civil strife. That goes back into China, ancient China and Egypt and Mesopotamia. Today, 2/3 of the people on Earth that have calorie deficiencies in their diet live in areas with conflict or natural disaster. There's a clear correlation. Trade restrictions. 131 out of 196 countries on Earth, 2/3 of the countries on Earth, are net food importers. What happens when there are food insecurity problems? We find that countries slap on food bans and trade restrictions and such, which only makes the problem worse. So trade, which ought to be something that smooths out food production and availability globally, it can be something that actually takes us in the opposite direction. And finally, I'll just mention inadequate R&D, research and development commitments. In the United States, I'll speak about my own country, our public expenditures on agricultural research on an inflation-adjusted basis are where they were 50 years ago. And yet, I think we all would acknowledge that we have greater challenges now than we did then. So to summarize this first section of my talk, the trends in food production that need to be sharply positive are not sharply positive. They are in fact negative. And in addition to that, we have other challenges that are pretty serious, other climate challenges, soil, water, conflict, trade, research and development. So the conclusion I draw from this is that we need to be thinking much more boldly and ambitiously about what we're doing with agricultural development. And we need to consider scalability, the ability to ramp up food production in all the different projects that we might have. So I want to talk with you then about one of the initiatives which we've catalyzed in the United States that we call the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. We started this, we initiated this about 1.5 years ago with the African Union and with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Since then, a number of countries have jumped on board and are doing a number of different activities involving soils and crops. The purpose behind this Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils was really to address hunger and nutrition issues, particularly childhood stunting, by focusing on the crops that are traditionally grown by women, and to help create long-term and sustainable solutions, and to provide options for farmers. I spoke earlier about the projections of what climate change would do to crop yields. Let me just show you a table that makes that a little bit more concrete. Here are the averages of something like 200 different climate studies. And I just want to draw your attention to Africa for a moment. The projection, it depends on which climate change scenario you're using, but none of them are very good. For maize, which is a dominant staple crop in Southern Africa, the projection for mid-century is negative 13% to production. For rice, negative 1%. For wheat, negative 23%. Now we can argue, and the academics will, about whether the projection for maize at -13 should be -15 or just -10. That's kind of not the point. The point is, it's not plus 50. It's not plus 70. It's not plus 100, which is probably what we need in Africa. All these are negative when they ought to be sharply positive. So what to do about it? Well, let me show you just actually two more maps. On the left is a map of Africa. It's color-coded by crop. And the left is where you will have the largest decreases in yield because of climate change. And I'll just mention that blue, the color that you mostly see on that map, is maize. That's where we expect the production, the yield of maize to go down substantially. There are a couple of spots of red in there, and that's sorghum. The map on the right, using the same colors, is the map of where we expect crop yield increases. And one thing you'll notice is, there's not much blue on that map, so not good for maize. And you'll notice mostly orange and red, and that's finger millet and sorghum. So there are some crops that could help us with increasing the yields in Africa, but it's not the crops that are predominantly grown there now, like maize. So what we did with our vision for adapted crops and soils was to go through a two-step process. The first was we looked at about 300 different traditional and indigenous crops in Africa, and we asked ourselves, which are the crops that have the most, are the most nutrient rich and have the most potential for supplying good nutrition, for example, to help children avoid childhood stunting. We came up with about 60 different crops. And then we ask a second question. Okay, how about those 60? How well will they do in a climate changing world? Are they going to do poorly like maize is projected to do, or will they do better? And as it turned out, most of the 60 we imagined could do rather well. The problem is they just haven't been invested in. We've put billions and billions of dollars, and many countries have been involved in improvement work, yield enhancement work with our major staple crops. But with many of these minor, what we call opportunity crops, very little scientific investment. And that's why we call them opportunity crops, because if we were simply to invest in them finally, we think we could ramp up production quite significantly. We have gotten a lot of support for this effort. It is a vision for adapted crops and soils, not an institution or a project or an organization. It's gotten support from the G7, from Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, UK, from the private sector, and from civil society organizations. And I want to particularly call attention to the fact that it's also gotten support in many ways, technical, political, financial, from the government of Japan. And in that regard, I'm just going to embarrass someone in the audience and say that my friend Yasuko Nishimura-san has been very instrumental in that. And I thank her very much. I'm very grateful for that support, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Our goal in this entire project is to build good soils, good, fertile, healthy soils that nourish the crops, and also to ramp up the production of the crops that can nourish the soils. It goes both directions. It really recognizes a basic truth. There's no such thing as food security without good soils and adapted crops. There's no shortcut. There's no magic solution. There's no pill we can take. We have to have good soils and good crops. We have focused on Africa, but we are expanding into Central America and into the Pacific Islands. So let me summarize this second of the 3 lectures. Our goal is not just food security, it's nutrition security. It's creating agricultural systems that have diverse cropping systems, diverse crops. So we're not just dependent on one or two. And that diversity of crops is what provides diversity of nutrition, of micronutrients, and addresses some of the human health issues that are associated with not having it. So that's the first thing, is to recognize our goal is nutrition, not just food security. Second is that where food is produced is important. And third, how food is produced is important. These are the basics. These are the fundamentals. This is what we've really, really got to get right. So now I'll quickly go to the third part of my lecture. This is a table showing how much of the global collections of crop diversity, the breeding material, the biological foundation for agriculture, how much is held by different countries for different crops. I will simply point out that there are no very big numbers on this page. And what that means is that no country has what it needs to, in terms of crop breeding programs for the future, for any of these major crops: wheat, rice, maize, beans, soybeans. And that means that we're all interdependent. All of the countries in the world depend on the collections, the resources that other countries have. If we want to use this collection of genetic resources, a collection of traits, to adapt to climate change in the future. It's this interdependence which I think really implies a global collaborative effort. And the reality is that when one country loses its diversity, all countries lose the diversity, and they lose it forever. So what are gene banks? We heard a little bit about that earlier. Gene banks or seed banks are places where you conserve this diversity. For most crops, it's in the form of seeds. The problem with gene banks or seed banks is that they're in buildings. That's one problem. And bad things can happen to buildings. I'm going to show you a couple of slides to show you how bad that can be. So here's a wonderful facility. It was a really good gene bank, had one of the major collections of wheat and barley, number of other crops. It was just located just outside of Aleppo, Syria. There was a civil war. The scientists had to flee, and the seeds were therefore endangered, even though the facility itself is a really good one. Here's a friend of mine, Nestor, who is one of the managers of the gene bank in the Philippines, and he's pointing to the level that the water got up to in his gene bank during a typhoon and a flood. The next day when the water receded, this was what some of his collection looked like. You can see some maize in a bag there. You can assume that that's now an extinct variety. It wouldn't have survived that. And shortly after the flood, there was a fire. So bad things happen to gene banks. It can be war, it can be equipment failures, it can be natural disasters, it can be funding issues, it can even be human mistakes. All these things happen. So what to do about it? Well, the great thing about seeds, at least, is that you can multiply them. You can make a copy. And so one of the things we wanted to do some years back in the early 2000s was to create a safe place for these seeds, for the duplicate copy, for the second copy of these seeds. And here's where I want to take you. We went quite far north. So you will see, let me see if I can point out this. Yeah. That's Greenland right there. And this is the northern part of Norway. And where we went was here. That's as far north as you can fly in the world on a regularly scheduled airplane. It's 78 degrees north. Place called Svalbard. If you want to preserve seeds for a long time, you dry them and you freeze them. As you can imagine, going there gets you fairly cold temperatures, relatively speaking, even in a global warming situation. So I'll show you a few pictures of what that place looks like and what we tried to do there. It's quite far away from everything. I think you can see it is 6,830 kilometers from where we are right now in Tokyo. It is a place of amazing, amazing beauty. I took this photograph actually from a helicopter. This is a glacier. To give you some sense of size, I think this is something like 300 meters tall. Huge. There is a small village there, a Norwegian village, and there is wildlife. So there are polar bears. There are more polar bears than human beings. There are reindeer. There are more reindeer than polar bears. And this is what we envisaged. This is what we planned for. So we wanted a facility that would have a tunnel going into the coldest part of the mountain so that we were going to freeze our seeds to minus 18, the same temperature as the Japanese National Gene Bank. Inside the mountain, we would get naturally about minus 5, which is good. And we would mechanically lower it from minus 5 to 18. Now, if anything goes wrong and the equipment fails, our calculation is we would have several decades, 20, 30 years, to repair it before it would really cause any problems for the seeds at minus 5. So pretty safe place. So this was our plan. You see the entrance on the left, a long tunnel into the coldest part of the mountain, and then 3 rooms at the very back that would hold the seeds. And we calculated that it could hold 4.5 million samples, which was frankly twice as much as I thought existed in the world. Here's the facility under construction to give you some sense of scale and size. Couple other photographs here of this facility in its natural environment. This was designed to have very little management involved. You don't need somebody to manage seeds being frozen. So we have no permanent full-time staff in this location. It's opened up several times a year for seeds to come in and on occasion for seeds to go out. If a regular seed bank that has deposited those seeds loses those seeds, something bad happens, such as the situation I mentioned in Syria, then they can get their own seeds back. It works in that way. So people will take the seeds in, and when you open that front door, you're looking down quite a long tunnel. And then you get to the actual room with the seeds, and inside it looks like this. It's probably the largest collection of biodiversity on Earth. There are 1.3 million samples now. That's 150,000 different kinds of rice, 150,000 different kinds of wheat, and so on and so forth. So this is what we've tried to do, what I tried to do years ago in Norway. Norway paid for the facility. It's operated internationally. It's operated free of charge. Governments around the world use it as a safety insurance policy, if you will, for their own collections at no expense whatsoever. Those governments continue to own the seeds that they have, and no one other than the governments themselves has access to them. So this has, I think, addressed one of the major problems of crop adaptation and production for the future in a climate changing situation. I'll simply say that the 3 sections of the little talk that I've given you today are united by a couple of concerns. One is that there are many things that we can and should be doing to strengthen food security. There are also a couple of things that we must do that are so fundamental and so basic to food security that we simply have to get it right. And those things involve soil, creating good fertile soil, and crops that are adapted to climate change. And that adaptation process depends on the kind of diversity you see here. I think we need to take more seriously than we are today the problem of climate change and its impact on crops. I think we need to believe our own research about what that impact will be. And we need to be thinking more creatively and more, as we would say, outside of the box. That's uncomfortable for any of us to do, particularly those of us who work in institutions, but that's the challenge. And we need to find ways to make our short-term actions and interventions helpful towards a long-term plan for adaptation. And then finally, I think we need to be making sustained, serious and substantial investments in research to cope with the kinds of issues that I see coming in 2050. So once again, let me thank JIRCAS and everyone involved in organizing this. It's been a pleasure. I always like to be here in Japan. Masa, thank you again for your kind introduction. And I really appreciate the collaboration we've had with the government and people of Japan. Thank you.
ファウラー博士、どうもありがとうございました。3つのお話ですね、食料安全保障と、あとバックスと、あと、現代版のノアの箱舟とも言われる種子貯蔵庫ですか、そのお話、たくさん、本当に盛りだくさんなお話をいただきました。どうもありがとうございました。